Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And if you regularly follow Midday with Reverend Don, you will know that you can type your question or comment into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and it will show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And we're having a lovely day here in Danville, Illinois. It's 46 degrees in February. Um, an interesting fact in and of itself, and something that comes with momentary delight and perhaps a little bit of worry about the effects of changes in the climate. But I've often said that the first things I ever heard talked about regarding climate change were in the metaphysical community at a point in time when the scientific community was not on board with the idea. And hello to Mary in the chat room, and hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you both. Um, and hello to Nikki in the chat room. And there was a lot of talk about the changes that were coming to the climate. There was talk about um, change in the coasts of the continent. Um, they tended to talk about things falling into the sea rather than the sea rising, but it's in the end the same thing. There was talk about the seasons dissolving and then reforming in a new way. All of this back in the 70s, um, long before any ideas of climate change were mainstream in the scientific world. And the thing that I remember most is that the general consensus was that this would be a troubling time to live through, but in the end, it would simply be the new normal, and people would not really remember how things were before. This is basically what I tend to think now. Um, will the new normal be better or worse? Well, we'll find out soon enough. And hello to Bright Eyes and to Janet in the chat room. Good to see you. But my subject for today is actually a subject of peace, but these things are relevant. Um, when our conditions change, often our definitions change with them. Um, the idea of peace is something we've talked about here before, and I was kind of motivated to this subject today because I see there's been another mass shooting, um, something I certainly don't remember from my childhood. Um, and it really does speak a little bit to our attitudes about peace. Because, in a manner of speaking, depending on what your definition of peace is, we are a nation that technically is at peace, but we're certainly not, in any meaningful sense, at peace in our daily existence. It's a time of great division and strife. Um, and it really speaks to how your definition of something changes how you look at it. When I was a child, back in the 60s and the early 70s, I don't remember regular mass shootings, although there were a couple of them. But what people were more concerned about then were bombings. You may not, when you think about the 60s and early 70s, think of bombings as something that was on people's mind. But if you're old enough to remember it, you'll know that it was. The idea that you might be shopping in the shopping mall and someone may have left a bomb in a trash can that would go off unexpectedly. This was a serious concern to people like my parents, for example, who did not live in a major metropolis. They lived here in Danville, Illinois, a comparatively small community, although certainly not the smallest, particularly then. But it was a serious concern. But when people look back on this time, they don't remember that. There were a huge number of protests and riots and so forth, aimed at bringing change to society, which for a short time they did. Um, but this was a major concern to people. It seems like people have largely edited this out of their memories. So when we look at the things that are happening today, 20 years from now, if you're a young person, you'll then be an older person. And you may be surprised when some young person refers back to the peaceful years of the new century because they have chosen not to remember some of the things that were happening. But if you look back through the last 150 years, there are a lot of social upheavals, and I'm just talking about the United States, that are rarely mentioned in our history courses and not widely remembered, certainly by people. I mean, who today remembers the Pullman strikes or how many people remember the struggles of the labor movement in the early 20th century or the any number of violent confrontations that happened um, in earlier times? It seems like society edits these out of its memory. And one of the things this does is it tends to lead people to always think they're living in a time that's more divisive than previous times when the reality is that we've always kind of been that way. Yes, certain times are worse than others. Um, when I think about my childhood, many people expected a full-blown revolution any day in the 60s and early 70s. Um, it was a serious concern to a lot of people. And there were all kinds of people either working for or working against this um, who must have been very disappointed later in life when nothing like that came. Um, and when I think of a relatively peaceful time, the 80s were a relatively peaceful time in my life, more so than the 70s. The 90s still had a certain amount of that, but certainly the new century has lost any resemblance to a peaceful time. But that depends on how you define peace. And um, I wanted to talk today a little bit about how we define peace, what it means to us, and a little bit about the Correllian Peace Campaign. And the Correllian tradition has had a lot of focus on the idea of peace for many, many years. And this was championed for a long time by the Reverend Sir Terry Ott, for a time by the Reverend Sir Colin Keller, and and currently, our leading peace warrior is the Reverend Sir Rolando Comonapu Agama in the Philippines, and many other people working for this campaign. And hello to Steve in the chat room. It's good to see you, Steve. And what is the idea of the peace campaign? It's to bring more peace into the world um, through both conscious action and also through energy working and through prayer. And of course, the common response that we've so often gotten to this is, well, you can't have perfect peace. Why are you trying? And the answer to that has always been, well, no, you can't have perfect peace because, for one thing, your definition of peace will change as you get more of it, but you can always have more peace than you have now. And why would you not work for it? And I look at the state of the world sometimes, and I ask myself how successful our peace campaign has been. But then I also ask myself, well, where might we be if we hadn't done it? And hello to Sarah in the chat room. It's good to see you, Sarah. I'm a great believer in the idea that praying for peace, working for peace is never a wasted occupation, even if um, you'll never have perfect peace, because perfect peace kind of means that you're dead. That's when everything will be perfectly peaceful. As long as we're living, we'll have growth and change and various things that interrupt our peace. But that doesn't mean we can't be more at peace than we are. And what is peace? And this is the thing that I usually come down to when I have this talk, which I do periodically. And peace is not just the absence of open conflict or the absence of military conflict. A lot of people confuse the idea of peace with not being at war. And on the surface, that sounds very obvious. But if you stop and think about it, it's not really obvious at all. Because there are many times that many different societies have uh, been in a state of political peace with other societies and in themselves, and also been inherently and deeply oppressed um, in ways that were preventing open conflict. Um, if you look back at the history of the world, there were a lot of times when there was not a political conflict going on because people could barely survive, um, because the government was holding everyone down in various parts of the world. And hello to Christine in the chat room. It's good to see you, Christine. Yes, that is peace in the sense of not having a war, but that's hardly living at peace. To me, being in a state of peace is living in a just society where everyone can exist who is living a peaceful life. If you're not hurting anyone, you shouldn't be being hurt yourself. And hello to Brenda in the chat room. It's good to see you, Brenda. Um, to me, that is what we mean by peace. It's not just the absence of open conflict. Um, if you cannot, if you cannot live an equal life with your neighbor, it doesn't matter that there's not an open conflict. You're not living at peace. You are in a state of being oppressed. Um, could be for racial reasons, could be for political reasons, could be for gender reasons, and none of those are good reasons. There's no good reason that a person who is living a just and peaceful life should not be able to live a free life, being who they are. And that is the position I will always take. And of course, we will disagree on many things in life. But as long as we can disagree peacefully, there's nothing wrong with disagreeing. As long as we can treat each other decently, we can disagree and still be at peace. It's when we are not treating each other decently that we are not at peace, and it doesn't matter whether we're visibly at war or not. So when we talk about the peace campaign, we're not talking about military conflicts, although certainly those are included, but we're talking about anywhere where a reasonable person who's not hurting anyone else cannot live a decent life. And hello again to Sarah in the in the chat room who says yes, and people judge people so much. And this ties into the recent story involving Will Fiacco, who basically was asking for a genocide against non-Christians. Now, I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon, but the fact that there are people who actually think that would be a good thing speaks to the absence of peace in this world. Um, and we are seeing it in some parts of the world. I mean, some of the laws that mostly American missionaries have seen implemented in parts of Africa, for example, are horrendous in how they treat other people. It doesn't matter if that country is at war or not; it is not at peace. Um, if you're going to kill your neighbor just because they're a little different from you, you are not at peace, and you are not a peaceful person, nor are you a good person. That is not, in any sense, being a good person. Um, and yet there are people who pat themselves on the back for being good, righteous people based on how much they hate other people who are different from them. Um, and this is part of what the peace campaign is meant to fight against. There are certainly military conflicts all over the world. Always have been, probably always will be. And if they're not one day in the future, I don't know if that necessarily means we'll be at greater peace. It just means that it will be less open. Um, but this is not the only place where peace is lacking. I think that certainly as Correllians, we need to stand up for the idea that people should be allowed to live in peace who are in fact living in peace. It's one thing if you're running around planting bombs somewhere. It's one thing if you are being violent. But if you're just living your life, there is no reason for people anywhere on Earth to be persecuted. Hello to Vivian in the chat room, and it's good to see you, Vivian. And this is why we have a peace campaign. Now, how did the peace campaign get started? This is a relatively important story. It was 9 years ago that we started the peace campaign. Now, the Peace Weaver Order and the focus on peace goes back much farther than that in the Correllian tradition. But the Peace Prayer Campaign goes back 9 years. And the reason we started it is that we felt that there were forces in the world disseminating ideas of hatred and fear for the purpose of destabilizing the world. And we felt this was quite intentional, and we felt it was metaphysical. Certainly, there were political forces um, that could be said to be doing that, but we felt it was metaphysical in character and therefore needed a metaphysical response. And I have seen nothing to change my point of view on that subject. And this is why we set out to try to counteract this in an energetic metaphysical manner. Um, of course, it wasn't only to counteract any intentional, but also unintentional um, dissemination of hatred and division. And Christine in the chat room says, how can I become more involved in the Correllian Peace Campaign? There are a number of Facebook pages, which would be a good place to go if you're on Facebook. International Peace Warriors would be one of them. Or you might want to contact the Reverend Sir Rolando Camon, who is on Facebook. And I would say that is probably the easiest way. Or you can go to Correllian.com, look under groups, and find them listed under orders. There are the Peace Weavers and the International um, Peace Campaign, International Peace Warriors. And these would be the two obvious places I would send you. And there are others, and if you look on our various sites, you'll find them listed. This has been a major occupation. Oh, and Christine says, how can I become more involved? Well, every month there is a rolling peace prayer. And of course, there are many people who do it every day, who raise and send out energy to try to increase the energy of love and peace in the world. The other thing, however, is to try to embody this in your life, to look for places where maybe you can personally bring peace, or at least encourage peace, to look for things that you can do that will help other people um, to live their lives um, without persecution. These are the kind of things one can do. Um, and you could say that no one person can necessarily do all that much, although there are exceptions to that. But by and large, we can each of us do just a little bit. But if each of us does do just a little bit, that's a lot. Um, One of the things, Mr. Edward always liked to talk about how people overestimate what they do in a year, but underestimate what they can do in a decade. And this came from one of the various speakers that he admired. And I have found this to be very true. But, this concept also applies to people underestimate what a small amount of effort can do when many people are doing it. And, you don't have to, Archimedes once said that if you had a lever large enough, you could move the earth. Um, this is true. But if you also have enough people pushing in one direction, you can also move whatever object needs to be moved. And so, whether you can do something big or whether you can do something small, anything you do is going to be good. We talk about We talk about peace a lot, and too often it's similar to when people talk about perfection. And their idea of perfection turns out to be wholly unrealistic. And there is a book that I read when I was very young. Um, Not a very glamorous book to mention, but it was the novelization of the original Battlestar Galactica. But it had one very insightful paragraph in it, in which the protagonist talks about people's idea of perfection. And in this case, he's talking about the belief that although he seems to be in a very good situation, that there's something just not quite right about it because it's too good to be true. But the point that he makes is that when people think about perfection, they don't actually stop to think about it in a practical way, but only how pleasant it can be for them. And I tend to think that this is often true for peace, that many people only stop to think about what would make things better for themselves, or they think about their immediate surroundings when they think about peace. And, I have to say, for most of us, many of us, we have a relatively peaceful situation. Um, but that doesn't mean that the world is at peace. We tend to not want to think about those things that seem far from us. It's only when it comes close to us that we stop to think, oh, this is important. And it is important, I think, to always be thinking about how we can build a better, more peaceful world. And again, that peace is not just the absence of conflict. There are lots of people from lots of different minorities who can tell you that there were some very peaceful times that were not peaceful for them at all. Um, there have been terrible injustices throughout human history. And we don't need to name any one place on earth to find terrible injustices. They've been everywhere, where people have been persecuted for, what centuries later seems like silly reasons. One of the ones that occurs to me in the building of the Great Wall of China. Do you know who did a lot of the construction of the Great Wall of China? It was the educated scholars of the day, because the emperor who built the wall had a war with with the educated class because he wanted to rewrite history and famously burned all of the classical texts in China. Supposedly, anything dating before that time survived only because certain scholars had memorized them and managed to live through that purge and then rewrite them. When we look at that today, that seems kind of silly. Why would you erase your own history? But we also see a lot of people who have done it historically. Even in the last decade, we saw it going on in the Near East. Um, there are always groups that want to erase everything that came before them. This, whether there's a physical conflict going on or not, is a good example of times when there is no peace in the world. Times when um, people are persecuted simply for being who they are. Um, there are a number of places where we see that one country has overrun another country and eliminated anyone who they thought could possibly stand against them. The slaughter of the Polish aristocracy shortly after World War II is an example of this, or at the end of World War II. Um, Basically, everyone with a higher education who could be rounded up was exterminated for the purpose of pacifying the population. Um, People are horrible to one another very often in history and in the present. We wouldn't have to think very far to think of examples of people who either are being horrible to one another or would dearly like to be. They also love to fill up the news waves. Um, And, when you see this, if you're a reasonable person, it's very depressing. Um, and you ask yourself, what can I do about it? And, when you're looking at some prominent person elsewhere in the world or even next door, there's not always a lot that you as an individual can do about them or what they might be doing, but what you can do is influence your own world. You can influence those things where you do have a vote or a choice or where your actions make a difference. And what I would say is even if it's only a small action, um, look for the actions that you can take to make a better world. And in the end, you'll have a better world. If you ignore it, you're going to get what you get. And I have always been a believer in this point of view. And I think that when you focus positively on the changes you can make, when you focus positively on the things you can do, when you look at that next right thing that you can do, instead of obsessing over what might be negative and worrying about it, that you're doing the right thing. And when you see people who are constantly obsessed with everyone else, but doing nothing good themselves, that too is very depressing. And I don't even have words for that. To me, the thing to do is always the next right thing. Speaking of the next right thing, we said hello to Brenda in the chat room earlier today. Brenda will be our guest next week on, I believe, Tuesday, talking about the upcoming lustration. And this is going to be a historic lustration because it will be a double investiture of the new first priest and priestess. The first double investiture since 1979. And of the people who were present in 1979, only two are still living. And I imagine of those people who attend this double lustration or this double investiture at this lustration, chances are there won't be another chance to see exactly that ceremony again, because it will be a long time, if ever, before that happens, because it's not what normally happens. Um, and so I hope that you will consider coming to this lustration. And of course, it will also be widely covered through video. So we look forward to having you in one ways or another. Now, Christine says, in the chat room, my granddaughter and I sent a cranky pharmacist love darts while we waited in line to talk to her yesterday. It immediately brought us peace, and when it came our turn to talk to her, we greeted her with smiles, and she was a lot nicer than normal. In the past, we've let her have a negative impact on us. The love darts worked wonders yesterday. Absolutely. I think that, a smile, a kind comment, a positive energy can transform almost any interaction to a positive one. So, with that, I see we're coming to the end of our half hour. I want to thank you for joining me, and let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to always bring greater peace to our world. Help us to always do that next right thing and build the better world we hope to see. And we thank you for every time you move us to positive action. And knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. I'll be back tomorrow. And until next time, may you be blessed.